Hello, and welcome to A Critical Dragon, where I talk about narrative in film, television, and in books. And today I am joined by a very special guest, Janny Wurts. Hello, Janny.
Hello.
Um, and today we've been having a couple of discussions about general fantasy topics because I'm quite enamored with the Wars of Light and Shadow, and the last book, the final book, is being released next year, isn't it?
That's right, May.
Um,
Coming in May.
and so it's an undecalogue, an 11-book series, but it's a good word. Um, but because of that, we'd actually been having a chat about fantasy and different aspects of fantasy writing. And one of the topics that you had mentioned was magic and how magic and the fantastic are incorporated into fantasy writing. So I thought this would be a great chance for us to discuss this and let other people listen in.
Privileged to hear. It's a great subject.
So when a lot of the discussions happen in the modern day about fantasy and in particular magic, one of the things that makes me bristle a little tiny bit is the defaulting to talking about magic as magic system. This systematized
Put my hair on it.
Because magic systems exist. Like my PhD thesis was on the impact that RPGs have had in the genre and this systematic approach to designing fantasy narratives. But it's not the only approach. And if we default to magic system as the norm, then I think we're overlooking quite a lot about what the fantastic is, what magic can be in fantasy. So what do you think about this?
I think you're hitting it right on the nail because you can watch a flower grow from a seed and not need to know a thing about the science that makes it happen. And even the science stops short of what makes that seed alive and that seed not alive. Define life. What exactly is it? When exactly does the seed sprout and become alive? Is it dormant dead or is it alive before that? So chicken and egg, we've been having these philosophical arguments as long as time. So why do we have to know everything about everything all at once, right up front loading it? Why not let the story unwind it? And why not give the imagination free play to fill in the gaps, to fill in that liminal of any 6-year-old can watch a flower bloom and not have to know a thing about how it happens to appreciate it. So this constant need to know everything all at once, to me, locks everything tight in a box and takes away the individual expression of what happens between the lines, that interaction between you and that word, because no two reactions to that word are going to be the same. It will be different as every person in the human race. So how have we narrowed the possibilities of what we can think if we have to know everything and exactly how it works all at once? It's not magic then, it's a system.
It's a system. It's become science, and there is room in the genre for texts of that approach. But I think because of the focus on that as magic system, this is what you must do. I think people forget that it is only one approach, and there's plenty of room in the genre for radically different approaches that are aimed at or are trying to accomplish something different, something in terms of awe, something in terms of majesty, something in terms of the ineffable, to to talk about it in those terms, that magic can be wondrous or whimsy or any of these things. And depending on the narrative, depending on the story being told, the idea that it must be an imposed system, I think, is incredibly limiting, not only in the types of stories then that people will be telling, but in the types of stories that we as readers can actually enjoy. Because if that is our default, if that is our norm, then something that diverges from that or is doing something completely different, we are starting to read it with completely the wrong assumptions in place.
The whole thing about drawing limits and insisting on a definition, you said a magic system is now science. Well, let me tell you, I thought I was going to major in science when I was in college, and I was actually hired by the astronomy department to do research. I was running the telescopes, I was running the planetarium. And the number of times where I was running the telescope and I was just there to point at whatever object the class wanted to see. Okay, I would set the calibration and bring in into the telescope what they wanted to look at. The number of times that I sat there with 4 PhD astronomy professors next to me, and I would say, "What is that?" And they go, "We don't know." And I said, "Aren't you even curious?" "Well, no, we can't be curious about that because we can't write a paper on that." And that's when I asked science, because they had defined what was acceptable to science and acceptable to write a paper and acceptable to show in public or acceptable to study. And they left out anything that didn't fit in a box, which was probably most of it. So it's not that I don't respect scientists, I do. We've done incredible advances as a human race through science, but the idea that everything has to be nailed down, quantum physics disproved that a long time ago. Electrons are only in one place if they're observed. Otherwise, they're in several places at once. You have a possibility, range of possibility until they're an observer, then it becomes a single point. So if we're each a single point of observation and no two are alike, and we got to systemize everything so everybody is thinking alike, we just made ourselves into wind-up toys. And is that desirable? Is it fun? That's not fun. Science wasn't going to be fun for me if I had to write off all the things that they said, "Oh no, we can't write a paper on that."
And yet like, there is comfort and security and for a given value of joy and enjoyment in having mastery over something and understanding something that puts us in a very secure, comfortable place. And that is a type of reading that sometimes we want to engage with, but other types of reading are putting us somewhere that is uncomfortable or challenging assumptions, challenging notions. And innovation occurs more frequently in thinking outside of that box, in looking at something that is doing it differently than in trying to just iterate on the same thing over and over again. And I think that imagination, that leap to outside the box, a different way of approaching it, that is the lifeblood of innovation within the genre.
But that happens because we play. When you mention mastery of a topic or mastery of a skill, you're no longer thinking of it as play anymore. You're bringing an expertise to bear. You're setting certain boundaries of what things you will not do because it's sloppy or amateurish or whatever, because you brought a honed mastery to it. But the more you master a topic, the less room there is for play because so many technical aspects come in. So to me, the imagination does best, innovation does best, thinking outside the envelope does best when we remember how to play. That's something that's kicked out of us pretty earlier for some people. The responsibilities that pile up, you have to do this, you have to meet that. When do we allow or value as a society time to play? And often liminal occurs in fantasy where it isn't systemized, is a play on concept, a play on emotion, a play on words that makes you think past what that symbolized word hits on the page. Maybe couple this word with that word, you have a synergistic combination that's going to push that liminal, that's going to push that aspect of play. It's going to bring your imagination into play to fill in that gap. The magic really happens.
And I that's like an excellent point on this, because the abstract notions created by that unorthodox combination of terms or approach, it creates an abstract notion that we aren't fully in control of as reader, that we don't fully understand. And because of that, there is a freedom to interpret, to imagine, to play with the concept. But that is almost the antithesis of what can be seen as quite a modern focus on the controlled mastery of the literal.
The standardized test. There is no play. There is no liminal. There is nothing but pairing batch box to check. So where does this huge aspect of control enter in? Is it because we have too crowded classrooms and kids have to conform in order to keep order? Is it because society has gotten so complex and, you know, parents think dangerous, you have to control every minute? You know, I've seen kids where every hour of their day is scheduled. We go to soccer, we go to ice skating, we go to this, we go to that. The room to play, the freeform play where you could get yourself in trouble is almost gone.
And you know, societies continue to shift and change. If we even look back at Victorian England and how children were regarded and what a child was, like we've radically changed that concept. And you know, there will be movements and changes to societal norms, but play and imagination are so essential to creative thinking and creative problem solving. So even in fields like engineering and science and technology, it's the innovation is to think of it in a way that is not necessarily the orthodox. You have to understand the orthodoxy, but you have to be able to imagine beyond it. And with fantasy, a genre that at its core is about exploring the unreal, the non-real, the fantastic, something beyond the norm, that trying to create orthodoxy within fantasy is almost running against the grain of what fantasy can accomplish and what it can show us.
So yeah, where does fear enter in of being out of control? Because when you play, and you really play, you're throwing off limits. When you play words or play with a concept or play with a book, you're not in control. You're totally not. There are no breaks where that book's going to take you, unless you're one of these people that has to read the synopsis first or read the flap and read the last page. I mean, there are people who are obsessive that way, but you know, a book takes away your control. So at what point do people balk at, don't want my understanding challenged? I don't want my limits challenged. I don't want my inability to challenge. I'm afraid to step out of that controlled situation where there are rules and I know what is coming. So are we talking a fear reaction? Fear, control, training?
Well, I think training has part of it, how our education systems are set up, what we emphasize, what we get each generation to practice and master, and that approach. You know, how we train people to read and the techniques that we use, these have significant impact in literacy and the perception of literacy and our fluency with media analysis. And you know, we do live in quite a time when literalism and this sort of mimetic materialism is held up as the high standard, and fantasy doesn't necessarily conform to that, which causes, I think, certain types of fantasy to be privileged because they do lean more into that, but it damages our ability to read, enjoy, and explore the other types of fantasy that don't do that.
You know, a huge shift in the demographic that reads science fiction and fantasy. It was a fringe read. For years, it was a fringe read. Before my time, in the 40s and 50s, it was only the weirdos who read this stuff. Then it was sort of the nerdy people, and they were not considered wonderful at all. They were mocked. When did nerd become trendy? With computer, you know, with computer design, was that when nerd became trendy? Now we have huge influx where fantasy and science fiction has become very mainstream. And so what I see, a lot of the big thundering 2x4s that are coming down and smacking the plank and killing all the little things that could be cool. It's simply mainstream thinking stepping in. And mainstream thinking has always been, you follow the lead. You don't deviate from the herd, because that isn't safe. If you're the lone wolf, you're likely yourself in trouble. And that is not a good survival trait. It is not a success in life trait. You are going to fail at what you do. So how much of that is the mainstream trend? Not that I'm knocking that. I'm glad to see more people enjoying fantasy and more people looking to, but that's become really hip now. There's a movie out there that crashes the box office. It doesn't have some element of science fiction in it anymore. Even the advertising on TV is loaded with everything. Has become what used to be a niche market. Used to be only the odd people that didn't have friends, that sat home and read books all day. So how much of what we're doing is mainstream crashed in and come and imposed its own structure over top of what used to be a free and crazy anything goes?
But we even see that with the construction of genre terms, which, they were always loose labels to help us categorize in ways to make material manageable, to sort of, they weren't definitive concrete ghettos. They were meant to be terms and labels to help us group text together. And then they became commercialized terms. And then we had the subgenreification of everything, where it's this type, and the specificity was increasing to ever absurd levels. That it's an epic, dark, adventure, heroic fantasy in a secondary world. That the need to label and control it. Whereas if we look back at a lot of the early, what we would call science fiction and fantasy, they were weird tales. It was, the boundaries were not, it is fantasy or science fiction. It was quite often more to do with, no, it's not a realist story. It's a weird story. It's playing with notions of reality. It's bringing in aliens and magic.
Yeah, it was pulp fiction. You weren't meant to take it serious. The smart people didn't read that stuff, and serious people and grown-ups didn't touch it. Talking the chauvinism that fantasy is, or imagination is, for children, and you're meant to grow it. That is a completely falsely imposed thought process. And yet people buy into it by the cattle car, that imagination is somehow obsolete once you grow up and get responsibility. So pulp fiction was certainly the bottom of the literary heap. Nobody took it seriously, so you could get away with doing anything. But where it was a wide open, no one was going to criticize you for reading bad pulp fiction, right?
And weirdly enough, like a lot of the early science fiction and fantasy works that we have were some of the most experimental forms of fiction, that they were breaking new ground in how we perceive, write, consume, engage with narrative. That you had Ballard writing this stuff that was just off the wall crazy. And they could do that because there was this disregard of the genre, this snotty elitism, that it wasn't doing the norm. But there was freedom in that to experiment. And some of those things we now see deployed routinely in mainstream fiction of all genres, because early science fiction and fantasy and weird tale writers were experimenting with it, we're playing with it, we're trying to find all of these different things. And there was such joy in that because they were working outside of the system.
What was it Roger Zelazny said? He got rejection after rejection after rejection until he stopped explaining anything. And when he wrote the books and then chopped out all of the explanation about what anything meant, instant success. He was all the rage.
Well, you had very kindly supplied a few examples of some liminal magic that we can discuss. So why don't I bring this up on screen, and we can talk through a couple of these examples. Oh, okay. Well, this isn't an example of the liminal.
Whoops.
But you know, if people are interested, you can pre-order the Song of Mysteries, the last book in the Wars of Light and Shadow series. All right, that's another one that's not the liminal. But again, very beautiful artwork, and like this is actually great. So it's coming out in May. Is that the
May
release?
2024, yeah.
Mhm. Okay, so you'd selected this from Fortress in the Eye of Time by C.J. Cherry. C.J. Cherry has did one of those series. Was it the Foreigner series where there were so many aliens, and I think it was one of the first times I ever thought of alien in non sort of human terms. And C.J. Cherry really made aliens feel alien, at least for me. But you'd selected this one.
Well, also profanity is not as well known nor as appreciated as science fiction, but this clip here is just a wonderful description of a place. But she uses that liminal play on imagination. She creates that air of mystery and lets you supply the grand civilization that she's describing is on and what is left of it. She's pulling on your feelings. She's forcing your imagination to think of what would have caused the erosion of that civilization into this, where the forest is literally drowning it.
Yeah, because if I let me just read this out because you know it might make it easier for some people. So call it Galician or Yennefer. It had become a shadow place from a shadow age. Its crumbling, weathered towers poised on the rock that had once been the base of a great citadel. The seat of power for 2 ages of wizardry had become, in the present reign of men, a place of curious, disturbing fancies. Yennefer, tree drowned in its sea of forest, was the last or the first outpost of the old lands. First, as one stood with his face to the west, where the sea lords of old had fallen, and new kings ruled, so soon forgetful that they had been servants of the ship, or the last edge of an older world, as one might look out north and east toward Elwenor and Amethel, which lay across the Linulim's windings beyond Marna Wood. So I apologize for my stumbled pronunciations there. So, like one of the beautiful things about this, Yennefer, tree drowned in its sea of forest. It is an incredibly evocative and yet quite abstract phrase, quite an abstract expression. Do you want to talk us through a little bit about unpacking it, unpicking it?
Well, she was talking about the ships no longer come, the old civilization has fallen, and she's still using that metaphor. And she's built up to the last wizard is going to create a shaping to try to change or affect the modern world, modern in this fantasy. But the way she sketches in one paragraph was lost, and that evocative mystery. People always say when you're building suspense in a novel, that suspense is always a threat to the characters or whatever. That's not all of the picture. Curiosity is one of the strongest drivers of human motivation in the book. And so she's making you curious as to what went wrong here, how did civilization fall, and what's going to happen now that something is going to be waking up there. Because she wouldn't be focusing lightly in on this section of landscape if it did not have meaning to the greater story.
And I think even there's a careful selection of language here because you have shadow place, shadow age, crumbling, weathered, and poised on the rock that had once been. So a lot of this emphasis on there's elements of darkness, of things have fallen into disrepair. And the idea that it's poised on a rock that had once been something greater, that there's a sense of temporality and closure to it. And even then that it's all about these curious, disturbing fancies that
And shadows, what's going on in between the reality of where men are ruling, because all of those old ghosts, all of those old, all of the things are going to connect with the modern story that she's going to tell. And so her calling back and using the language that she's going to use to describe the magic or the elements that are going to come forward, they're definitely elements of dream, elements of fancy, elements of things not everyone sees, but the wizards do. So every piece of language she's chosen in this paragraph is foreshadowing where she's going to take supernatural elements in this story.
and there's even juxtaposition of like, and new kings ruled, so soon forgetful that they had been servants of the she. That the contrasts brought up of, here's the new way of doing something, and in the new way of doing something, we've forgotten where we came from. We've forgotten what these things used to mean. We've forgotten our own history. We've forgotten our position, and that is this universal human truth that we constantly engage with and struggle with, remembering and understanding the past and our place in the universe, our place in the world. And so again, it's placing the contradiction of tradition and old ways and how we used to feel about the world with, this is the modern way, the new way. And in some respects it could be better, but in other respects it has lost something. And
forgotten what created the
express.
Forgotten the history that put them into this state of ruin. It's been forgotten. So yeah, very beautiful way of describing that. She packs an awful lot into just what some modern readers would call too much telling and not enough showing. But actually, she's inviting your imagination to participate and fall into this world and become a part of it. She's setting mood, she's setting feelings, she's giving you disturbing fantasies. She's giving you a snapshot of what the entire story is going to unfold. So ideally, it would bring your imagination into play and make you curious. What are you going to find out about all the force that took down this civilization, and what threat is from this old civilization is possibly threatening the rulers of men?
And I keep being drawn back to that tree drowned in its sea of forest. So you have the sea imagery of this citadel on a bastion, a rock looking out over the ocean, and yet it then suddenly is inverted and it's tree drowned, that it's an ocean of trees. This forest takes on a completely different meaning. And again, it's this freeing of the imagination in ways that it's not about the literal description of, this is your setting, place your figures here. It's about something wild and uncontained.
So yeah, it's a mystery. She's creating a mystery here. She's not giving you a magic system where tit for tat what to that civilization. She's creating the mystery, and as you read the book, it will unravel more. Does she ever nail it down and completely define it? The magic in this world runs on mason's lines, builder's walls, and she uses it in very unique ways. So it isn't like she doesn't develop anything from that. What are you walling out? You're walling out the shadows and the fancy, and the old world and the remnants of it. Nobody can remember anymore. And so she's setting up a system, if you think of it that way, by inviting you to participate with your imagination, so that she will build on every single word she's used in this paragraph. Fortress in the Time Unraveled, the title of the book. Fortress in the Eye of Time. It's like everything is still there and all the movement is around it. So she's good at playing psychological games with your mind. And I think her fantasy is very underappreciated for what it is.
I'm not familiar with this one at all.
This book is give you encapsulation. If you like the company, this is the Black Company with heart. So it follows a similar storyline in that there's a young scribe that's hired by this group of mercenaries, and they're up something probably no good. And he's this young innocent scribe, and you come to learn that this before him got killed. So it's if you into the Black Company, if you like lots of swordplay and you like a lot of dark magic and dark crazy stuff going on and coarse language, raunchy humor. So I would call it the Black Company heart, and it's a pity it's not known because it's a really, really original and well done story that when you get to the third book, it takes it in very startling directions. So Donna and I both love this. So this was one my husband enjoyed also.
Because one of the things that I've noticed in discussion of certain aspects of fantasy writing online, where people have been giving advice on how to write fantasy, and there was criticism of a text in which the author had introduced a fantasy term, and if we were using this as the example, it would be the impression of the Sildune. And it's, well, what is the Sildune? You need to stop your narrative now and explain this. And I was looking at this advice and thinking, why? We get enough from the context that we can understand roughly. And as the text evolves, as we move through the narrative, as we get closer to the end of the book, we're going to get more and more information. We're going to get more context, which will then, if we think back to this moment, we will suddenly realize what we should have seen at the beginning. But now we can see it differently because we're closer to the end. And this idea that you must front load the information, that is something that I find is a very modern conceit that I think is being promoted as a rule when really it's a choice and a style, but there is beauty to slowly developing piecemeal these breadcrumbs that add up over time to the complete picture, the complete encapsulation.
If you were to read this book, the Sildune are a form of mercenary. So that is the mercenary company. There's some really spooky things about how you get initiated into that mercenary company. Talk about dark. But I won't go into that. But this is the description in this paragraph is they're talking about a form of witchery or magic that women, trained women, and it's told from the point of view of another character that has some skill but no training. So you are getting the build up to what these witchy type characters can really do, which is frightening. So it's done in more modern dialogue, a little bit more modern language, but it still taps that liminal because it's a character describing that something that she doesn't fully understand to the character who doesn't understand any of it. And she's trying to explain something explainable, both because she lacks the knowledge and also because it's unexplainable.
And again, it's the joy of reading is finding out. Like that's one of the joys at the heart of reading is finding these things out and getting more information. And it feels like a reward when you have that aha moment. And in this, the use of limited subjective knowledge is such an incredibly powerful tool to show how characters can develop and gain greater understanding as well, along with the character or along with the reader. That, this is a technique that we saw with the use of the callow youth who knows nothing of the world and is going to be taken on a quest and have a mentor figure guide them and explain the world to them as they go. That's the audience surrogate. And here, it's a similar sort of thing that someone has slightly more knowledge than the reader. We get brought in with their part knowledge. And as the work is going to progress, we're going to get more definite or explored in different ways. And we build a composite picture. And I think that is one of the joys of reading is gaining this mastery over time, this exploration that initially your mind goes one way, and then later on the book reveals something and you go, oh, I was wrong that time, it actually goes this way. It's engaging with the exploration of things and that playfulness of where your imagination can go.
And is this character right? So when you finally run into one of these witchy characters, which will go? Is this a practical application of magic, or something that's totally terrifying? If you could read the paragraph, AP, since you have a beautiful voice for reading, he's building the mystery of which way is it going to go, and you know you're going to encounter, because the main guy who runs the mercenary company, his sister is one, a very powerful one. So you know there's going to be a head-on.
Yeah. So it reads, but from the stories, I always got the impression the Sildune controlled the Myrmidon. She shrugged. You can put a collar on a ripper and drop it in a cage, but unless you chop off the beak and rip out the claws, you still best step lightly, unless you like the idea of being real dead, real fast. Dead, I said, loud enough that one of Baron Brune's soldiers heard and glanced over his shoulder. I carefully lowered my voice again. Don't they do what you do, or something like it? I don't understand. Why are they so dangerous? She waited until she was sure no one was listening. They can creep through a man's memories. Same as me, sure enough. Said they can track a man by his memories too, though I couldn't hazard a guess as to how. So the Sildune use them as spies, doing recon and the like. But it's also said they can strike a man down just by looking at him, cripple, maim, kill, drop him in the dirt like a stone.
So yeah, this building sense of dread, building sense of, I don't understand how it happens. I don't know what kind of danger we could be stepping in. Jeff is using the liminal here, pushing the feelings, your emotions, building the dread, and not doing it by telling you exactly how this works.
And certainly the initial thing of talking about a ripper and then making that comparison to the witch type, because that's how dangerous they are. So it's using the analogy within the diegesis, this diegetic analogy. And even though we as reader are completely outside this world, we still get the danger, the sense of wildness, because this ripper, you can take off its beak and claws, like you can disarm it, and it can still be incredibly dangerous and kill you. And now we're going to apply that sense, that feeling, to talking about people with this magical ability that isn't understood, that we don't know how exactly they do this, but there are fables about them, legends, thoughts, concepts, and this is frightening. The unknowable and unknown can be very, very scary, and that builds up that atmosphere of we don't know, and that's where the tension is coming from, at least for me in this.
So yeah, all done without giving you a point system, saying this witch is stronger than that witch, all without anything relative comparison at all. Only what's rumored, what's not known, what's guessed at. And so you have to find out. And of course, as the story unwinds, you will encounter this up close and personal in all of its vivid horror and glory. So building that food using the imaginative liminal is what Jeff is doing here, and he does it exceptionally well.
I know that I know the use of the very modern language here, that that goes against it was something that Le Guin had said in her From Elfland to Poughkeepsie, the idea of creating the fantastic through semi-archaic or overly formalized language, that you're building it in that way. And yet we can see, because of the flexibility of what fantasy actually encompasses, you can use incredibly modern language to evoke the same thing, but it's all about the control of the language. It's it's not necessarily that there is a blueprint or a prescription, a prescribed manner of doing things that you must do. It's about understanding the effect and impact your language choices have.
It may be my language. It's evocative, creep through a man's memories, cripple, maim, kill. All those have huge ramifications behind them. The echo that those words throw, like dropping a stone into a pool. So you're getting an interference pattern with all of these words piling up that are building that sense of dread, that are building that sense of the unknown. So modern language effectively used works incredibly well. Jeff been very, very careful about which words he chose to use. He didn't throw in any excess and he didn't swap around. He went for the one word that was going to that creeping sense of dread and build that echo.
So this was another one that you'd picked out by from The Bell at Sealy Head by Patricia McKillop. And McKillop, again, another great fantasy author who, you know, does not get spoken about as
grandmaster. She should have been a grandmaster 10 years ago. It's just really bothers me that she never saw that when she was alive. Had a lifetime achievement, but some of the most beautiful language fantasy and never a tit for tat system in any of her magic. And yet her books are some of the most poetically magical in the business. So in this story, there's a bell that rings and not everybody hears it, but the entire town revolves around this bell ringing, and characters can hear it and what that ringing of that means and how it meshes into a magical world. It's almost like that's the interface. So that is terribly underappreciated, but she's totally brilliant with language. As you can see, if AP will read the paragraph, but again, she's tapping that fantasy liminal. She's spurring that imagination, fill in blank. She's creating that sense of mystery, and what she can build in that sense of mystery and curiosity is immense, and she can do it very economically.
now, seeing her fate in the ritual, she wondered suddenly, intensely, how far back in time did that line of children go who had inherited this piece of the pattern? How far forward into the future would the unborn children go? What would happen if everything stopped? So that morning, she started to scrutinize the details of her days, beginning with the scrap bowl. It changed daily, she had thought, according to the amount that filled it. For the first time, she realized that the bowl itself never changed. Only its size varied. The bowl was silver and copper, always gleaming. It must have been polished daily. Still, it seemed very odd, with its odd lumps of uncut jewels decorating the sides, ribbons of copper wandering randomly over it, the shadow, here and there, of age that no care could remove. What were these crows that must be fed each day from that magic bowl? Who made the magic?
Isn't that fascinating? She's taking a detail out of a person's life who did something every day without question and making question it. Looking at the ordinary and seeing the extraordinary, all in that one paragraph, and making you wonder what is going on with this ritual. Why these crows being fed every day from the same bowl? What magic is going on here? There's not a single systemized piece of text in this to tell you concretely what is going on. It's all done without any concrete term.
And it's so wonderfully evocative, and it's something that we see in magic realism as well, of the fantastic being made the familiar being made the fantastical, and the blurring of the boundaries between what is fantasy and what is reality. And ritual aspects of our lives, something that we do without thinking, can suddenly take on new meaning, new resonance. And just this one tiny detail, and how McKillop just controls our way through it, through that description, through those beats, through those little tiny details. It creates, at least for me, something incredibly evocative and beautiful. And it transports you into the world in a way that big flashy action sequences sometimes just do not do. That this is a quiet moment, and yet you are drawn into this reality because of the beauty of this language and how this is evoked on the page.
So yeah, she's a master of that master of allegory. What are the crows standing? She's probably the most accomplished master of allegory in the field as it stands today. But yeah, where is the point system here? How would you make a game you couldn't? It's too big to systemize what she's describing here. She's too far in what lies outside the envelope, and she's demanding that your imagination follow where she's taking you. And if you're not flexible enough to fall into the cracks here of what she's talking about, then you probably aren't going to enjoy her books. If you're just on a concrete knowledge of what's happening exactly and what's going to precisely, Pat's not going to be author, because she takes you outside the envelope in a magical way that is a wonder to behold.
And again, I think this is part of the beauty of fantasy as a genre, because it is so incredibly flexible that there are all these different approaches that can be taken. And no matter our personal preference, we're always able to find authors in the genre who can create something beautiful that speaks directly to us. And so even if this is not your style, this is not the thing that you want, you can still admire the craft and the beauty and the sublime in this. That this is not the action adventure computer game or MCU approach to superpowers and magic standing in for superpowers. This is something where magic is integrated into the reality. And because of that, it makes the reality at both at once familiar and defamiliar. And it's that space, that liminal threshold between the two, that enriches the narrative and provides that wonderful sense of just the fantastic. Okay, so this is the last one I think that we'll look at today, Janny, if you don't mind, and it's from your book Curse of the Mistwraith, the first book of the Wars of Light and Shadow. Do you want to give a brief introduction to what this is, what this scene is, what you were trying to do with it?
The characters are going through a mountain pass. They are being attacked by an old creature that's supposedly out of legend, according to some people in the world, but definitely very real. Not the biggest monster that's available on this world, but you might think so going into the scene. You might think the biggest monster that there is. So here's this character carrying a very, very old sword who knows nothing about what it can do. And in the heat of the crisis, the character is told, draw the sword, and prefers to try everything else first. So this is the moment where the character does draw that sword, and the first encounter of this character seeing what it is he's really carrying. Now, there is a little break in the middle where I attached another phrase to complete this sequence just for this video. There's a little bit more in between that, which is more action sequence, but that's been removed for the purpose of because again, we were talking about the liminal and implying things that aren't there, and a range of expansion beyond what our sense can tell us and beyond that we know. So AP, it's all yours.
The dark blade slipped from the scabbard with a sweet, cold ring. From the instant the tip cleared the guard loop, Arathon was touched by a haunting sensation, like song, like loss, like a peal of perfect harmony set vibrating upon the air. His ears rang to a timbre so pure, his heart flinched, and the sword in his hand came alive. Light ripped across the silvered lines of inlay, blindingly intense, a shimmer like harmony distilled to an exaltation of universal creation. Arathon had known mage work, but never, ever had he touched a force that left him feeling bereft, as if the world where he stood had grown coarser, more drab, somehow clumsy and tearingly lacking in a manner that defeated reason. Arathon stared at the blade in his hand and felt lacerated for no reason under sky he could name. So just looking at this to give you my impressions of it, one of the things in fantasy that I was always fascinated by, the magical sword, Excalibur, the sword and the stone, all of these magical blades that we get in fantasy. And yet there was something so beautiful about magic and creation, which is the antithesis of the weapon, which is an instrument of destruction. And here we have the dark blade, which slipped from the scabbard with a sweet cold ring, this juxtaposition of opposing forces, both beauty and being disconcerted, something that is not quite right. This peal of perfect harmony, and yet it's so pure, so beautiful, it causes his heart to flinch. This contrast between the two things. This is an unknowable, ineffable object, but it has definite properties. It is a physical thing, and yet it goes beyond the mere physical into this fantastical reality that it cannot be fully defined, fully laid down in what is on the page. It has to be more abstract than that. That yes, it is a sword. Yes, it is this weapon, but it goes beyond those things. And so much of this is about that sublime, the highest emotions the mind can experience. And I think you perfectly capture that here.
The whole concept of the world being a coarse and drab place compared to something that can be defined, and that packed into a weapon, is it really for killing? It's setting up a mystery for later that the books are going to solve in slow motion. It's an 11th series, but that juxtaposition of something that's not even a white steel blade, it's black, it's a dark blade, so it's dangerous, it's sharp. Characters have cut themselves on it before, earlier in the story, and suddenly this other facet to it, it's so contrary to what you would think of a sword doing, and all done without a point, without an on switch, without clicking the laser beam. So again, tapping into that liminal of trying to describe something that's beyond the senses by comparing it to the reality we know, which is less than something that's so far greater. Everything that we know look less than. It's tapping the imagination to span that gap, because language can't go there.
And again, like, you run through the different sort of sensations here, because obviously there's a clear comparison to song, to melody, to harmony, and that ties in with Arathon's perspective, because it's his perception. Of course, he has an affinity for this, but through that analogy to aspects of sound, it's then also light, and because of that, it's we're only trying to understand the magic through the senses that we have, and magic goes beyond that, and it is something that can be so wonderful to see in works of fantasy that admit that the fantasy goes beyond, the magic goes beyond what we understand and see in reality. And again, as a different technique, you could make it very, very mundane, and magic becomes commonplace. Magic becomes set down in materialistic or literalized terms. Or we can set it free to go, the best that we can understand is that it's on the edge of our consciousness. It's this thing that exists just beyond our sight, just beyond our perception, that we can only get the barest hints of it and understand it through analogy.
Yeah, you've nailed it. Exactly that. Exactly that. Using language to make imagination fill in the gaps of an experience that's beyond the world we know, giving us a window into something that's not concrete.
And I think this is part of kind of what we've been exploring and discussing here, that there are multiple approaches to this, and certainly like nailing the magic down, making it understandable, giving the reader mastery over it and understanding over it, that is one way of doing it. But these other ways of extending the mystery of magic, of showing us that it's something we can only ever grasp the edges of, and we have an imperfect understanding of it, that can create this mystery, this wonder, this sense of awe, this sense of something slightly beyond us that we're just reaching for but can never quite fully grasp. That is this amazing feeling that can be exploited and played with within the text. And it's a very different approach, and yet there's such beauty to it.
It's a different form of entertainment. One is more concrete, action oriented, tit for tat. And it's a different kind of entertainment. Your brain can go to sleep a little bit reading those kind of action scenes where the rules are all laid down ahead and you're kind of looking at wild picture unfolding. Well, that's pretty cool. But it's not necessarily evoking the liminal, engaging a different form of entertainment, a different fascination. It's like watching karate experts go out in the ring. You know, you can admire the mastery of the technique, but can you imagine what they're going through on the other side of that? If that karate mastership required magic, you wouldn't see it because you're presented with the more mundane picture.
And
they're both valid.
The approach of like this aspect of liminality, this thing that we are reaching for, you know, in some ways it reminds me of, you know, when we were younger and you looked at a shadow that was projected on a wall and went, that's a monster, that's a bird, and that sense of imagination, of creating the fantastic out of the mundane, of seeing the fantastic in ways that were more real than real. That aspect of imagination, when it is given free rein, or even if it is controlled within a large space, that there are boundaries, there are limitations, but it's not rigid, it's more flexible, and there's room for different interpretation, for different feelings and evocations. That instead of trying to nail everything down into a strict pattern that it must follow, that there is a freedom of play within these broad boundaries and lines that are across the page.
So yeah, it's about writing about things that we don't know yet, haven't defined yet, that are a little bit dangerous because they're slippery. They don't fit in a box. And so that feeling can be made to feel threatening, or fearful, or make you feel emotional. The range of expression is as broad as human experience. But to express something that doesn't exist, to evoke something in another person based on a word without explaining it up front. To me, that's one of the biggest attractions to fantasy for this type of literature. That keeps me being.
And, you know, it's why I've spent so much of my life studying fantasy. Like I have spent a ridiculously long time reading and studying and analyzing fantasy. Not because I sort of went, well, I have nothing better to do with my life, but there is just something so rich and beautiful and deep and textured about all of these different approaches. And the variation, the challenges to the mind, to the spirit, the soul, the intellect, all of these different aspects of ourselves that get played out in different ways. And I just adore fantasy. And in discussions where people fixate on magic system, it it always dims that light a little because it is such a limitation and such a narrow view of what fantasy is, what magic is, what can be achieved with this literature. And
Don't
so
we read fantasy for what we don't know? I read fantasy for an experience I never had, for what I don't know, and to evoke what I don't know and expand that so that when I put that book down, I might look at a bowl differently, or I might look somebody who can second guess you as that person reading your memories. You know, the possibilities of what fantasy can open up can have access into our daily thinking, but not if we already know it all.
and I think the more that I know, the more that I know I don't know. And that this is always a journey towards works that I haven't read yet, techniques that I haven't explored yet. The more I study, the more I realize how little I understand. And it just means that the future is this wonderful vista of exploration. It's not frightening. It means that there's new things to know, new things to find, new things to explore. And when things sort of retread the same ground over and over again, that is something that I am less enamored with because I am excited about the new and the unknown and these unexplored countries.
Some people feel threatened by that. Some people do.
Yeah.
So I don't know. To me, fantasy is the essence of fantasy, is stepping beyond what we already know. But I don't understand necessarily the obsession of having to know it all up front. Just to see what happens when you know it all up front. You know, there are other kinds of surprises, but I don't know. It's like reading with one eye shut. You're only getting half picture.
Well, and on that note, Janny, I just wanted to thank you so much for taking this time out of your day to take this time to go through this stuff with me. Thank you very much for this, Janny.
Oh, you're welcome. It's my pleasure. I always enjoy having discussions with you, AP. You have an interesting mind and can in any different directions. So the time just flies. Thank you for asking me.
Well, I did like that. You have an interesting mind, and it's such a polite way of going, you're a bit odd. So, Janny, thank you very much. And for those of you still watching, thank you very much for watching. Thank you for your continued support, and I will see you in the next one.